All right. I think we're where we're supposed to be. Thank you, everybody. Well, I'm glad to see everybody is here. And did everybody have a good Sabbath this past weekend? I hope.
Kim, do you want to click the OKs at the bottom of your screen to get that message about cookies off? It just gives us a little more real estate.
There you go.
Okay, good. All right, so we should say the blessing. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kishanu mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok divrei Torah. Okay, great. So let's pick up our reading in the Exodus version on verse 5 and the Deuteronomy version, because it's verse 9. Okay, if one person can read those two, that would be great.
Okay, I'll read verse 9.
Yeah, 9 in Deuteronomy. It's
9 in Deuteronomy. You shall not bow down to them or serve them, for I, the Lord your God, am an impassioned God, visiting the guilt of the parents upon the children, upon the third and upon the fourth generations of those who reject me.
And let's read one more.
But those who reject me, but showing kindness to the 1,000th generation of those who love me and keep my commandments.
All right, let's hold that verse in mind for a second. Okay, and if somebody will read verse 5 from Exodus.
You shall not bow down to them or serve them, for I, the Lord your God, am an impassioned God, visiting of the parents upon the children, upon the third and the fourth, upon the fourth generations of those who reject me, but showing kindness to the 1,000th generation of those who love me and keep my commandments.
Okay, the texts are very parallel, but I want to get at a word that is often translated in a very problematic way. Does this expression, and I that I am an impassioned God, is that what, does that sound familiar?
Yeah, but I always thought it was, I am a jealous God.
Exactly my point, Stan. Usually, ever since the King James version of the Bible came along, the translation was a jealous God. This is a more modern translation, and the word impassioned has been used instead. What do you think the difference is when you hear the word impassioned or jealous?
Well, either word kind of anthropomorphizes God.
That's true. I mean, the whole process here, this is God speaking. So there's a huge context of
I call it
God as a human-like figure speaking.
This is our projection or the extent of our imagination.
That's one way to look at it, yes. And I remember a very long time ago when I was graduating from my class in my synagogue. I was elected to give the speech. I was like the number one person in the class. And I did a little sermonette on how ridiculous the idea was that's expressed in the Torah. I have since changed my view. Uh, the idea of um, anthropomorphizing God, or another important word, which is not one that we might use as readily, anthropopathizing God. One is God is physically like us, or we are physically like Him, or we are alike in emotions or in feelings. This text, whatever you want to say about it, and there's more to say about it, is really the term is anthropopathizing rather than anthropomorphizing. This is not about God and human beings having the same physical characteristics or projecting our physical characteristics on God, which is something that happens with regularity in various parts of the Torah. You know, the idea that God um, listens by inclining his head and bending his ear closer to us. That's not what this is about. This is about the emotion of jealousy or um, or passion. So what would it mean? What does it say when we say that God is jealous, or God is um, uh, impassioned? They don't mean the same thing in English, for sure. Yeah, Stan.
Yeah, just a note here. Uh, Instead of using this, I think this is the 74 translation. If you go back to the 1917 one, it does use the word jealous.
Yeah, that was for many years the standard translation, although it comes originally from the King James Bible, but it was used in either also in earlier Jewish translations because it was so familiar to people. This is how people normally translated it. But there is a problem. Why? What is it about the word jealous that might make it problematic or confusing?
It to me, it's sort of a negative emotion.
How so?
If someone is jealous of someone else, it's considered a negative uh, uh, emotion, where impassioned is different. Impassioned just means strongly believe and trying to convince others of your belief.
Yeah, I think that you're in the right ballpark there. Um, this has to do with an older meaning for the word jealous. When you say, for example, jealous as in envy, that's one thing. But jealous also means uh, the protective or owning something. I'm jealous of my prerogatives,
Right.
for example. Well, that's
But
not about
so it's not a demeaning kind of like
it,
like if I told my wife, I'm really jealous when you go out and talk to some guy. It's not that kind of jealous
no, it's not that kind of
at
jealous.
all. Yeah,
It's
that's it.
jealous in the sense of wanting to assert or to be clear about something that, in a sense, belongs to you. This is a crazy day with the phone, and I don't know why it's doing that.
So impassioned is really curious too.
Well, impassioned is also not entirely. I'm not entirely comfortable with impassioned, but impassioned is closer in the sense that it's not about. It's about strong feeling.
But it's not compassion.
No.
No. What does it mean, do you think, that when it comes to the Israelites, that God is impassioned?
He really feels strongly about something.
Yeah. What is it that he or she or it feels strongly about?
That he's the only God, and there are no others that are anywhere near like him.
Sure. But the context here is not so much about God's prerogatives. It's about the relationship between God and the Israelites. What God feels strongly about is that relationship, that link between the divine and the human. This is something that leads God to, as it were, like again, anthropopathizing. God feels very strongly.
And I think
God,
that,
yeah, go ahead, Jody.
so I was going to say that one of the reasons that such a strong word is used, impassioned or jealous, is because I think talking about the relationship between God and the Israelites, God knows pretty much the nature of the Israelites or human
Yeah.
beings. And that is to say that people are fickle, and they are easily misled into idolatry and not making God the only one. And it seems that God knows that he has to take a very strong hand with these people, because they are not going to respond to just very even words without any emotion behind them. So I think that the reason that God is impassioned or jealous is because he knows who he's dealing with.
I think that's true. God does know who he's dealing with and recognizes the limitations on the human side. But see, that's precisely the point, that the relationship between God and human beings is not, to have that relationship is not dependent upon human beings being correct or fully understanding who or what God is or what the relationship is. That the human fault is not something that disqualifies them from having a relationship with God. And the idea, of course, is that we already know that God, that on God's side, God can be animated by destructive or angry emotions, as in the giving of the Torah and the breaking of the tablets. So the picture is one of two parties, both of which are capable of failing in their job of relating and connecting to and having a relationship with the other, although for slightly different reasons. So the question becomes, I think that impassioned is a better translation, because it's about how strongly God feels about the Israelites, even though they sometimes do things that causes God to be angry. And if you think about it, you think about your relationship with your spouse or with your children, even in the best of those relationships, it's often the case that your partner does things that make you angry or upsets you. And not only do you feel angry and upset, but that those feelings, however strong they may be, do not break off the relationship. And that, I mean, I suppose in the extreme cases where there's a divorce, that's different. But short of feeling the need for divorce, within the regular relationship, there is room to accommodate passionate feelings, both positive and negative, towards the other party. And this is something to bear in mind, because one of the great criticisms of Judaism over the years is God is often pictured as a God who gets angry. There are things that Israel does that pisses God off. But even so, the relationship accommodates those reactions. That's something very important, because you cannot postulate the unbreakability or the permanence of the relationship unless it can be stretched to include all sorts of emotions, and not just kindly ones or happy ones or positive ones.
And even broken, right?
I'm sorry?
And even broken, not only stretched, but broken at
Well,
times.
well, that's exactly my point. It gets stretched so much that you would think it would break, but it doesn't. So despite the fact that Israel sometimes does things that test that relationship in extreme ways, I see it, Sam, that doesn't lead the link or the connection, the relationship to break. You can't. So that here's the best thing about it. This is a way of speaking which allows the relationship between God and Israel, or God and humanity in a more general way, to persist, even though human beings are deeply flawed and say and do things that anger God. So now, in terms of understanding this relationship, this is one of the reasons why Judaism does not have any, doesn't really have anything like excommunication. The relationship between Israel and God persists despite human errors, even the most egregious human errors. And when you think about it, any strong relationship has to be able to accommodate those kinds of possibilities. I think it's interesting that becomes one of a part of the groundwork of the relationship between God and Israel. It's so important to understand that the relationship between God and Israel is not dependent upon Israel always doing the right thing, not ever making a mistake, not ever behaving in such a way that it puts God's devotion to them to the test in an extreme way. And it also demonstrates, this is why this is followed up about the third and fourth generation, and the 1,000th generation. Human beings are going to screw up. They're going to screw up in terrible, stressful ways. Somehow that has to be accounted for, even though there is some sort of price to be paid. The price is not so great that it puts into jeopardy the whole relationship. The relationship exists despite that. You want to go to Judy and then Kim.
So I understand that this is a contractual relationship between Israel and God.
Yeah.
How does God, what is the Jewish perspective on how God would view the transgressions by others who are not Israelites, the Nazis, for example?
Well, I don't know that the Nazis are specifically in mind of the text. But
I know, but I'm just saying other human beings who commit atrocities, real crimes, sins.
well, the Torah doesn't speak in great detail about what other groups can and cannot do. However, having said that, there are a number of places where there are hints about that. For example, when at one point when Israel fails to observe God's word, God says, "Are you not like the Ethiopians unto me?" The idea being that the Ethiopians, as in this example, also have a relationship with God, and that relationship is not the same as a relationship with the Israelites, but it is its own relationship with God. The Torah does not. This is pretty heady stuff. The Torah does not predicate itself on the idea that only Israel has a relationship with God. Other peoples also have a relationship with God, but it's not the same relationship.
I'm thinking of the story of Jonah and God's, I'm thinking of the story of Jonah and God's statement that are the, about the, now I've forgotten where he went, Nineveh, the people of Nineveh, like baby children, but, I'm concerned about them. Why should you be concerned about this gourd that you neither created nor nourished?
That's another example which indicates that God has a relationship with others. You think of the story about the prophet Balaam, where Balaam is God's intentions and God's word are accessible to him, even though as a quote unquote prophet, he is not an Israelite. So there are a number of different ways in which the text indicates that God has a relationship with other peoples. But it also includes the idea that God's relationship with Israel is unlike God's relationship with other peoples in the earth. Now, that's a very tough needle to thread, because Bella, that's why what I mean by a tough needle to thread is that each of the nations that has a relationship with God has a relationship that is special. That, I'm gonna have to have a talk with these people again. I'll be right back. Bella?
Hi, Debbie.
Hey, good to see you.
Nice to see you.
Thank you.
Never got to the guilt of the parents.
Yeah.
Okay. So,
We're not making great headway here. We haven't gotten to the guilt of the parents, nor the
Oh,
next part.
well, that's coming right up. Coming up. So, in the context of this relationship between the Israelites and God, when you think of any of the really strong binds that there exists in human relationships, the connection that we have with a spouse or with a child, maybe the child is even a better example. It takes a lot to end such a relationship, even when our children do things that we just don't agree with at all, or not just don't agree with at all. We have great difficulty in countenancing. The idea of disowning a child, for example, it's something that happens so rarely because we will accept so many things, so many actions on the part of our children, and only maybe slightly fewer from that are done by our spouses. Such relationships are most of the time able to accommodate those challenging kinds of behavior. You have to go pretty far before you're willing to break them off. So this is something to bear in mind, because the criticism of Judaism by Christians often is that as a religion of law, it's all about doing everything perfectly. And if you don't, then your relationship with God is cut off, as opposed to Christianity, which is a religion of love, and therefore more inclusive. I don't think that the text actually supports that view. I understand why it's made. There's a theological agenda that has to do with the ways in which Judaism and Christianity separated from each other in the 2nd century. But I think you have to really view the Torah text in a very narrow sort of way in order to make the argument that there is no room for Israel to, what should I say, misbehave, or to act in error, or to make mistakes. God might get angry, but the anger does not end the relationship. It doesn't cause God to break it off. There are almost too many examples even to count of this from the Torah text. We've mentioned 3 of them so far, but there are others. Okay, so yes, Stan.
Yeah, I'm thinking, particularly when you compare it to other peoples in the Bible's narrative, where God commands the Israelites in the conquest of the promised land to obliterate another people. And I think in some of those instances, God indicates those people's practices were so heinous that there was no redemption for them.
Well, I think you and I might part company on that one, because there are plenty of examples of there being fundamental disagreements between God's point of view and the point of view of other nations. Was it you, Stan, who mentioned Jonah? The point about the book of Jonah, which is of course a later text, is that the Ninevites are capable of repentance.
Right. Well, I was thinking more Sodom and Gomorrah. They
Well,
had to be
the Sodomites
obliterated.
and the Gomorrans don't fare too well. They do get wiped out. But again, the issue, and that's not by the Israelites themselves.
Right.
The issue is there is an option, there's a possibility of redemption if they will change their behavior. The text implies or states that Lot tried to accomplish that, but he was unsuccessful. But that's another story. It's very complicated, but I'm glad you brought it up, because even then, the possibility of redemption is referred to in the text. So it's not like it's, as they say in college athletics these days, one and done. It was not, God's relationship with various people around the globe was not one and done. I skipped Kim, who I promised to recognize before. Why don't you go ahead?
Well, two things. One is this seems to be a statement that they're against monotheism. That God is saying there are other gods, but you should not serve them. Not that they don't exist.
That is a very interesting point. How would it be possible for God to recognize that there are other gods that the Israelites might worship? And if we're talking about in the encounter with the Canaanites, there's a certain level of syncretism, and the belief in these other quote unquote gods has an impact on the Israelites. How is it possible that God could say, you can't bow down to these images, or so on and so forth? Why is God's position here so loose?
Well, it could be like a political statement where he's saying that I know you think there are others, but not really acknowledging it, but just so he doesn't turn people off.
Well, I think we need to fine tune that a tad, because I think the difference really is not whether or not there are other gods who are really gods, but that there are from a descriptive point of view, many peoples around the world who believe in other quote unquote gods, but who are not really gods. So,
does this mean anything that when it says you shall have no other gods besides me, the gods is a small g, and
yeah.
It's a big G. I am the Lord your God. Now it's a big G.
It's a big G, but the problem is that the Torah doesn't have capital letters.
Right. Okay. Yeah.
So it's hard to translate that into English. Okay, Stan, you're on.
Yeah, there's a difference, the mountain and et cetera, between Isaiah and Micah, that very famous passage, and in the end of days. And Micah adds something that's not in the Isaiah translation, and that is at the very end, that other peoples may follow their gods, but we will follow Adonai, our God, forever, or something. I'm paraphrasing.
Yeah.
I could bring it up, but the very definitely by that point, and it's well after the time that these texts were written, uh, God is acknowledging that there are other peoples who follow other gods.
Yeah, and this is an understanding that's carried on in the rabbinic tradition. You all, I'm sure, have heard from one rabbi or another how God went to the different peoples of the earth and offered them the Torah. And they said, what's written in it? And God said, well, you're not allowed to commit murder. Oh, well, our ancestor was a murderer. We can't accept the Torah on those conditions. Israel being the only nation that accepted the Torah. But that's, even as we say that, that doesn't go so far as to break or to nullify the relationship God has with other peoples. God may have a relationship with other peoples who do not accept basic principles that God represents or that the Israelites have accepted. So there is no theological reason for God to end the relationship with this people or that people or the other people because they don't feel that they can accept the Torah. So the idea, I think it's hard to get this into our brains because we're so used to viewing it in different directions. So we used to viewing God's relationship with people as being, in effect, very tenuous. That if you screw up even a little bit, then the relationship ends. I think that the Torah in a number of different places, and we refer to a couple of them, demonstrates that even with very basic principles, God's relationship with other nations in the world is not dependent upon their accepting those points of belief. That God has a relationship with all peoples despite what their theology might be. And you can, I think, imagine to yourselves what that would mean in terms of the latitude that Israelites have, or that Israel has in its belief structure, that does not in the end so seriously challenge the relationship with God that it's in danger of breaking. So it gives a very broad understanding of what is acceptable belief, or at least belief that can exist within the context of a living relationship between God and Israel.
It's
And
1 o'clock.
so it gives room for theological divergences among the Israelites, which is a huge, huge advantage theologically. There are theological principles that you might say this disqualifies you, but it doesn't disqualify you. That there are huge swaths of belief that are not necessarily accepted, but which even so do not break the relationship. All right, we're going to stop
Oh,
here.
we go to 115.
Oh, yes, I know. I want to move on to the next section.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
Well, are we going to go to the guilt of the parents?
Yes. So what do the parents have to do with this whole issue of the relationship between God and Israel? how our parents,
I sense this, and this might be really far off, but there's this line to where Christ says, I come with a sword, I come not to bring peace. And I've read that what that means is actually separating parents from children because the parents aren't believers. And I sense it's the same thing of here, that's what the parents didn't follow the Lord.
well,
Is that crazy?
no, it's not crazy, but I don't think it's really what the text is trying to emphasize. There are two sides.
Kirby wants to say something.
Oh, I'm sorry. Kirby, your face is not up on my screen. There's go ahead.
Face is not
you're-
on your screen.
There you are.
With regard to that fifth verse, the third and fourth generations, that has always been difficult for me to understand, but some feel that this statement likely refers to the punishment of an entire household and not to punishment of children yet to be born. There are biblical examples of entire households, including, wives and sons and daughters and young children receiving punishment for acts of wrongdoing committed primarily by the male heads of households. A good example of that is Achan, having to do with the Battle of Jericho. And he hid some things, some silver and stuff. But anyway, it was not uncommon in the ancient world to have 3 or even 4 generations living in the same household. So I don't know if that's the correct explanation.
I think there's something to that,
Yeah.
but so I won't disagree with you, Kirby, but I would look at it from a slightly different angle. And the angle that I would look at it from is, as it turns out, from the study of sociology and so forth, that if you're looking to change the behavior, say in a house where parents are abusive, it takes 3 or 4 generations for such a change to take place. Serious malfeasance on the part of parents in a family, abusive relationships, what have you, are hard to change. They don't happen in 1 generation or even 2. You have to work at them hard enough over a long enough period of time, which sociologists would tell us is 3 or 4 generations for a change to action work itself through so that the group as a whole is governed by different principles. So I was just, maybe it's just a happenstance, I don't know. But the sociologists that I'm familiar with would say that, let's say, you have a father who is abusive. I used to do prison chaplaincy work, and I was very familiar with this kind of thing. Even if there is a serious desire to change, the abusive parent, the influence of the abusive parent will persist through several generations. And it's not until dealing with the children who are in the 3rd generation or the 4th generation that that quality of abuse has been overcome. So if we're looking at this from the standpoint, now, not from the standpoint of the children, but of the parents, that's the other side of the issue of the relationship. In other words, there's a lot of latitude for the children, the Israelites, for example, to make errors or to misbehave. Parents have less room in that regard because they're supposed to be responsible. Now, the question, when we talk about the relationship between God and Israel, we're talking about a relationship that has 2 partners. There are the Israelites and there's God. The Israelites the criteria we use to judge the status of the Israelites, that is to say, the children, are different than the standards that we use or the criteria we use to appreciate or to understand God's behavior. There is a bigger responsibility and less room for variation for the parents or for God than there is for the children, the Israelites. So I would view it from this kind of perspective. The children can make mistakes. They're going to make mistakes. The dependent entity in the relationship is going to make mistakes because it's a human. God is going to do things that God might repent of later on, but God is going to be held to account for that. Although it's different than it is for children. There's less room for God to screw up, in other words, than there is for children to screw up. Okay, I'm bound and determined to get to this next section today. Okay, so we're on chapter 7 in Exodus, and I need to move this. There we go. And the 11 in Deuteronomy. Will somebody read each of those?
Chapter 11,
Verse 11.
verse 11. You shall not swear falsely by the name of the Lord your God, for the Lord will not clear one who swears falsely by his name.
Okay, and the analog in Exodus?
Oh, hang on.
That would be verse 7.
Yeah. Okay. You shall not swear falsely by the name of the Lord your God, for the Lord will not clear one who swears falsely by his name.
Okay. When it says swears falsely by his, meaning God's name, what is the context of that?
Well, you talked about it last week, that it's a legal context.
Yeah, it's illegal using God as the appeal, the one to whom one appeals in taking an oath.
Right.
There is a huge amount of material in the Torah, in the subsequent commentaries and so forth, about making an oath, or and especially making an oath where you attest to the oath by appeal to God's name. It's a kind of analog to idolatry in a somewhat different context.
Or
What
What does the Hebrew say about the word clear? What that expression will not clear one?
Okay. Lo tisa et Shem Adonai Elohecha l'shav. Right. You shall not employ the name of God falsely. He lo yinakeh et yinakeh Adonai et asher ataleshav. So you can't, because God will not.
Is it like forgive?
Well, yinakeh it's the root meaning to cleanse.
To what?
Cleanse.
Oh, cleanse.
Yeah. God will, if you use God's name falsely, that is not something that just gets obliterated, doesn't get put under seal because you're a minor or something. If you use God's name as we usually translate it, following the King James Version, the name of using the name of the Lord in vain. It's actually not a bad translation.
Well,
what-
I always took that as swearing, but
Yes, that's exactly right. Most people say that that means you're not allowed to use uh, uh, nasty language. But that's not really what it means.
Nice.
It has come to mean that in some circles, but not as Judaism understands it. What is the context that's being referred to here? You shall not swear falsely by the name of your God.
You have to tell the
Swear
truth.
where? What?
You have to tell the truth.
You have to tell the truth, but where do you have to tell the truth? Under what conditions?
When you use the Lord's name, you say,
When would you?
I swear to God that this is true.
Okay, but where might you be called upon?
In court.
In court, exactly. We do this even today. You have to put your hand on the Bible and so on and so forth. You're saying that you're calling upon God and in a way to attest to the truth of your statement. And the context is in court. This is not about using 4-letter words or whatever. It's about how we either legitimately or illegitimately use the name of God to underscore the truthfulness of our own statements. So swearing falsely by the name of the Lord your God is about being in court and by reference to God, buttressing your own statement.
And you're being a false witness at the same time.
Yes, that's exactly right. And your testimony might be false, but you might use God's name in order to impress people who are listening that you must be telling the truth.
Yeah. And you're doing it knowingly, being a false witness.
Yes.
I think that's part of it.
Yes, it is. I think you're absolutely right about that. Oh, Kirby, I see your hand.
Microphone, Kirby.
Something going on here. Okay, based on this verse, it's been traditional for many Jews to avoid ever using the name Yahweh, saying instead Adonai or Hashim. What is your feeling about this, or what's is that more in the Orthodox sect?
Well, that's a very good question because there are a couple of confusions that the question represents. So let me try to untangle this a little bit. There are times when you misusing God by implying that God supports or God approves of what you are saying or doing becomes a problem. And the reason that it becomes a problem is that there's an avoidance of responsibility on the person who is using God's name. The purpose of using God's name is somehow to skate past having to be responsible for telling the truth. When we talk about using God's name, in Judaism, the idea is that we don't use God's name like ever. And the way, because it might be the case, even if it's not intentional, that you are attaching the authority of God to a false statement. It could be intentional, it could be a mistake, it could be simply an error of one sort or another. So using God's name is a problematic business because in the days of the Torah, taking an oath was thought of as very serious business. This was dangerous behavior. And you avoided taking an oath of any kind, and certainly one in which you are calling upon God's name. So that's point number one. Point number two, there is a kind of euphemism that's about what we think we can say about God, or we can assert about God. Namely, we don't want to be in a position where even inadvertently we're using God's name or appealing to God's authority in a way that distorts who or what God is. So we have euphemistic names for God that we use instead. So for a very long time, Jews have never used the name Yud-He Vav-He, which often gets read as Yahweh. That's another issue because it's not really, wouldn't be pronounced that way. I see you, Stan.
Yeah, I was going to just say, was always taught you don't do it. Just like if you went up to a monarch, you wouldn't say, "Hey, Carl, how are things going today?" You would, and that you would never, because Yud-He Vav-He would be God's first name, like you're Kerry or I'm Stan, and that would be insulting. That was the way I had learned it, the context.
That's
Kerry.
true. It's
Kerry, I
a
mean.
kind of familiarity that one would avoid. And Kim is reminding me that it's 1:17. So I can
Kim is
talk about what is-
Kim is using the shepherd's crook.
Ted Max amateur hour. Yeah. Can I have one more sentence, Kim? Okay, so when we say Adonai, the word that we're looking at in Hebrew is not Adonai. It's not, there's no actual way of pronouncing it. Adonai is a term by convention we use to replace Yud-He Vav-He. Okay. And it comes also in the form of a double Yud. So we all know what we are referring to when we use those terms. We just don't use the terms. It's kind of like in Harry Potter when they refer to Voldemort as he who shall not be named. We all know who we're talking about, even though we don't use Voldemort's name. Okay, so we're gonna have to, I'm sorry we don't have enough time to go a little bit further, but we got to this verse. I'm very proud of us for doing that. So thank you all very much for being here today, and we will see each other next Thursday.
Right. Thank you very much, and Shabbat Shalom coming up.
Thank you. Same to you. Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.